The sheets were silk, impossibly smooth against Alara's bare skin, a cruel reminder of a life she no longer lived. Below them, the city of New York glittered like a carpet of fallen stars, a silent witness to her surrender. His body was heavy above hers, a warm, demanding weight that pinned her to the mattress. His breath was hot against her ear as he moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that was both maddening and intoxicating. A broken sound escaped her lips, a name that felt foreign and yet achingly familiar. Julian, please. Was it a plea for him to stop, or a desperate appeal for more? In the haze of sensation, she no longer knew. Her mind was a battlefield of shame and an unwanted, traitorous pleasure that coiled deep in her belly. His hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back as his lips found the sensitive skin of her neck. A deep voice, accustomed to command, rumbled against her. "You're mine tonight, Alara. Only mine." And in that moment, under the weight of his possession and the crushing burden of her choices, she was. Hours earlier, she had been just a girl shivering in a borrowed dress, standing before the monolithic glass and steel tower that pierced the night sky. The silk dress, a deep sapphire blue, felt like a costume, a lie against her skin. This was the first time she had sworn to herself, the first and the last time. The image of her father, pale and frail in a hospital bed, was burned into her mind, a constant, agonizing reminder of why she was here. The cascading debts were a tide threatening to drown what was left of her family, and this was her desperate attempt to build a dam. The private elevator ascended in unnerving silence, lifting her from the gritty reality of her world into his ethereal kingdom in the clouds. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, a sprawling space of minimalist luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows that held the city captive. And there he was, Julian Thorne. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the city lights, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was not the leering old man her darkest fears had conjured. He was younger, sharp-edged, and intense, with an unnerving stillness about him. As he turned to face her, his gray eyes met hers, and beneath the cold, calculating surface, she saw a flicker of something she didn't expect, a profound, almost tragic loneliness. Before the sapphire dress and the silent ascent into the sky, there was only the suffocating reality of her fourth-floor walk-up in Queens. The apartment was a collection of faded memories and pressing anxieties, a place where the ghost of a better life haunted every corner. The paint on the walls, a pale yellow chosen by her mother years ago, was now peeling near the window frame, like a slow, sad surrender to the dampness that seeped in during the rain. A constant, rhythmic drip from the kitchen faucet served as the apartment's dreary heartbeat, a sound that echoed the slow leak of her hope. This was Alara's world now, a far cry from the sunlit campus and the scent of old books in the university library where she once belonged, where her mind had been alive with the beauty of Renaissance art and the promise of a future she had curated with care. Now, her days were a blur of steam and the bitter smell of burnt coffee. She worked double shifts at a cafe downtown, her hands, once skilled at sketching the delicate lines of a Botticelli, now raw and red from scalding water and harsh cleaning chemicals. She moved through the motions with a practiced emptiness, taking orders, forcing smiles, and wiping down counters, her thoughts a million miles away. She saw the city's elite come and go, men in tailored suits, and women with effortless grace, oblivious to the quiet desperation of the girls serving them their lattes. They were a painful reminder of the world her father had once commanded, a world from which they had been violently ejected. The true monster, however, was not the poverty itself, but the debt that fed on it. It was a living entity, a predator that called her phone at all hours, its voice a rotating cast of strangers, some feigning politeness, others barely concealing their threats. Its letters filled her mailbox, official letterheads and bold, red warnings of foreclosure and legal action. The numbers on those pages swam before her eyes, an insurmountable sum that grew with interest each day, a testament to the totality of their ruin. Every dollar she earned, every crumpled bill she smoothed out from the tip jar, felt like a single drop of water against a raging inferno. It was a crushing, relentless pressure that stole her appetite and haunted her sleep. But even the debt was a secondary pain, a symptom of the far deeper wound that was her father. She would visit him at the clinic 3 times a week. The sterile smell of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the rich aroma of mahogany and leather that used to permeate his office. Arthur Vance had once been a titan in his own right, a man whose laughter boomed and whose presence filled a room. He had built his architectural firm, Vance Corp., from the ground up, his passion and integrity poured into every blueprint. Now, he was a fragile echo of that man, diminished by a stroke that had followed the catastrophic collapse of his company. He sat by the window, his once powerful hands that had designed buildings and held her securely as a child, now thin and trembling as they rested on the worn blanket covering his lap. He would try to smile when she entered, but the effort only seemed to highlight the profound sadness in his eyes. He knew he was a burden. He would apologize in a voice that was barely a whisper, a broken sound that shattered Alara's heart every time. "I'm sorry, my girl," he would say. "I'm so sorry I failed you." And she would have to swallow the lump in her throat, force a bright smile, and lie. She would tell him business was picking up at the gallery she pretended to work at, that they were fine, that he just needed to focus on getting better. Each lie felt like a small betrayal, another layer of shame coating her soul. She would leave the clinic with his apologies ringing in her ears, the weight of his failure settling onto her own young shoulders. It was after one of those visits, with the image of her father's defeated face seared into her mind, that she reached her breaking point. The apartment felt smaller than ever that night, the walls closing in. Sleep was an impossible luxury. She sat in the dark, the bluish glow of her laptop screen illuminating her tired face. She scrolled aimlessly through the internet, a desperate search for an escape, a miracle, a solution that didn't exist. She clicked on an article about the hidden economies of the city, which led her down a rabbit hole of links and forums. And then she found it. It wasn't a sordid site with flashing banners. It was elegant, discreet, and deeply unsettling. The website was called the Elysian Circle, its name invoking a sense of mythic exclusivity. The design was minimalist, all charcoal grays and muted golds. There were no explicit services listed, only vague promises of unforgettable experiences and discerning companionship for the modern titan. The women featured in the gallery were stunning, but they were portrayed not as objects, but as partners, pictured at charity galas, on yachts, in private jets. They looked powerful, confident, and untouchable. It was a carefully constructed fantasy, a beautiful lie wrapped around an ugly truth, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a world of unimaginable wealth, a world where men paid sums of money she couldn't comprehend just for a woman's time. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a sliver of terrifying hope, she navigated to the candidates section. The application was detailed, asking for everything from her educational background to her interests in literature and art. It was designed to feel like a high-end job application, not a prelude to selling her body. And then she saw the section on compensation. The numbers were staggering. A single evening could erase a month's worth of medical bills. A week could clear a significant portion of their debt. It was a lifeline, a poison-laced chalice being offered to a woman dying of thirst. A wave of nausea washed over her. The voice of her younger self, the ambitious art historian, screamed in protest. This wasn't her. This couldn't be her path. But then, the image of her father's trembling hands returned, the sound of his whispered apology, the stack of red-stamped envelopes. This wasn't about her desires or her pride anymore. It was about his survival. It was a sacrifice. A cold, quiet resolve settled over her. She began to type, her fingers moving stiffly over the keys. She filled in the blanks, curating a version of herself that might appeal to these unseen men. With each word, she felt a part of her old self dying, being packed away to make room for the woman she needed to become. As she uploaded a carefully selected photograph, her own face looked back at her from the dark screen, the eyes of a stranger, haunted and resolute. She clicked submit, and the sound of the click was the loudest thing she had ever heard, the sound of a door slamming shut on her past, and another, darker door creaking open to her future. The soft chime of the elevator arriving was the only sound, and then the doors slid open, revealing a space that seemed less like a home and more like a private gallery suspended in the night. The air itself felt different here, thinner, cleaner, scented with the subtle, expensive fragrance of sandalwood and old leather. There was no clutter, no sign of a life lived messily, only vast, open spaces, gleaming hardwood floors, and meticulously chosen pieces of minimalist furniture that looked more like sculptures than places to rest. It was a silent, imposing kingdom, and as Alara stepped out onto the polished floor, her reflection, a wavering, uncertain figure in its sheen, she felt like an intruder, a common weed in a sterile, curated garden. Julian Thorne turned away from the window, and the city lights no longer obscured him. He was taller than she had anticipated, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark, tailored suit to perfection. It wasn't a suit for an office. It was a uniform of power, worn as comfortably as a second skin. His dark hair was cut with a severe precision, and his face was all sharp angles and clean lines, a face that would be called handsome, but not in a way that offered any warmth or comfort. It was his eyes that truly held her captive. They were a startling shade of gray, the color of a stormy sea, and they moved over her with a slow, unnerving intensity. He wasn't looking at her body with the overt lust she had steeled herself for. It was something far more disquieting. It was a look of appraisal, of keen, analytical curiosity, as if he were examining the brushstrokes on a newly acquired painting, judging its value, its authenticity, its hidden flaws. He moved from the window with a fluid, predatory grace, his footsteps making no sound on the expensive rugs. "Can I offer you a drink?" His voice was a low, smooth baritone, calm and measured, a voice used to being obeyed without ever having to raise it. He gestured towards a sleek, black marble bar that seemed to rise seamlessly from the floor. On it, an array of crystal decanters glittered like jewels. She felt her throat go dry, the lie she was about to live catching in it. She wanted to numb the screaming in her head with the strongest thing he had, but a small, stubborn part of her, the last vestige of her pride, refused to surrender so easily. "Just water, please," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If he was surprised by her refusal of alcohol, he didn't show it. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips as he retrieved a heavy crystal glass and filled it from a chilled bottle. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. The touch was cool, brief, yet it sent a jolt through her system, a spark of electricity in the cold, sterile air. He took his own glass, swirling the amber liquid within, and instead of leading her towards the bedroom as she expected, he gestured towards the main living area. Her gaze fell upon an enormous canvas that dominated the far wall. It was a chaotic explosion of color, streaks of violent red and deep, melancholic blue clashing against a stark white background. It was raw, powerful, and deeply unsettling. "The agency mentioned your background in art history," he said, his eyes on the painting, not on her. "Tell me, Alara, what do you see?" The question caught her completely off guard. This wasn't in the script she had prepared in her mind. She was supposed to be charming, pliant, an empty vessel for his desires. He was asking for her opinion, for her mind, a part of her she hadn't agreed to sell. She hesitated, the glass of water cold in her trembling hand. "It's chaotic," she started, her voice small. But then, something shifted. The art historian within her, the girl who had spent years learning and loving this language, couldn't stay silent. The words began to flow, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. "But it's a controlled chaos," she found herself explaining. "The artist uses the impasto technique to build texture, to give the strokes a physical, almost violent presence. The red isn't just anger, it feels like grief, a wound torn open. And the blue is the isolation that surrounds it. It's about a profound emotional schism. It's not a comfortable piece to look at." She spoke for several minutes, losing herself in the analysis, the familiar comfort of academic language, a shield against the terrifying reality of her situation. For a moment, she wasn't a girl for hire. She was a scholar, intelligent and insightful. All the while, he just watched her. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, his gray eyes fixed on her face, listening with an unnerving stillness. The intensity of his focus made her skin prickle. It was more intimate than a physical touch, this feeling of being truly seen, truly heard. When she finally fell silent, her cheeks flushed. There was a long pause. The city hummed its distant lullaby outside the glass walls. A profound emotional schism, he repeated softly, testing the words. An interesting interpretation. He took a slow sip of his drink. I always saw it as a hostile takeover. The red, a smaller, passionate entity, being consumed and neutralized by the vast, cold emptiness of the blue. His interpretation was brutal, cynical, entirely transactional. It was the world viewed through the lens of a predator, and it chilled her to the bone. "You have a good eye," he continued, finally turning his gaze from the painting back to her. "You studied?" The question was a pinprick, deflating the momentary confidence she had felt. "I did," she answered, her voice tight. "At Columbia. I had to." Stop. She didn't need to explain why. The fact that she was here was explanation enough. "A pity," he said, and the words held no actual sympathy, only a detached statement of fact. He saw her lost future, as one might see a minor flaw in an otherwise valuable acquisition. He had successfully disarmed her, luring out the intelligent, passionate woman hiding beneath the terrified girl, only to remind her of everything she had lost. The air between them shifted again, the intellectual exercise over. He placed his empty glass on a nearby table with a soft click that echoed in the silence. The unspoken purpose of her visit, the transaction she had both dreaded and craved, returned to fill the space between them, heavier and more complicated than ever before. He took a step closer, and the vast, lonely penthouse suddenly felt very, very small. The click of his glass on the marble table was a period, ending the chapter of polite conversation. The story of the night was now moving into uncharted territory. He took a step towards her, closing the small, safe distance she had maintained. The sheer presence of him was overwhelming, a gravitational pull that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs, leaving her lightheaded. She was acutely aware of everything. The subtle, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of bergamot and something woody that was nothing like the cloying fragrances of other men, the way the fine wool of his suit jacket didn't crease as he moved, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of his breathing. Her own breath was trapped somewhere in her chest, her heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. He stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His gaze dropped from her eyes, slowly, deliberately, traveling down the column of her throat to the sapphire dress that covered her. "That color," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up into her bones. "It suits the woman I saw in the painting. Passion and a deep, underlying sorrow." The compliment was so specific, so analytical, that it felt less like a pickup line and more like a diagnosis. He saw not just the color, but what he believed it represented in her, and this terrifying insight made her feel completely exposed. He reached out and she flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. He seemed to expect it, and his hand slowed, its path altering slightly. He wasn't going to grab her. Instead, he reached for her shoulder, as if to feel the texture of the silk. But his fingers, long and elegant, purposefully missed the fabric, their tips brushing against the bare skin of her shoulder for a fleeting, searing moment. The touch was light, almost accidental, yet it ignited a firestorm under her skin. Goosebumps erupted down her arms, and a shiver traced a path down her spine. It was a touch that bypassed her brain, her fear, her shame, and spoke directly to a part of her that had been dormant for years, a body that had been starved of any contact that wasn't accidental or transactional. He pulled his hand back as if nothing had happened, but she knew, and she knew that he knew. It was the first move in a game she didn't understand, a game where he was making all the rules. "There is something else I want to show you," he said, his voice still calm, as if he hadn't just sent her entire nervous system into chaos. He gestured for her to follow him to a more secluded corner of the vast room, near a window that offered a dizzying view of the river, a dark ribbon cutting through the city's glittering fabric. On a pedestal stood a small bronze sculpture of a falling figure, beautiful in its tragedy. He began to speak about the artist, about the tension between gravity and grace captured in the metal, but his words became a muffled drone in Alara's ears. She couldn't focus on the art. All of her senses were consumed by him. He stood beside her, not looking at the sculpture, but at her. His gaze was a physical thing, a weight she could feel on her skin. It traced the delicate curve of her ear, then moved to the frantic, tiny pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He saw the way she unconsciously twisted the thin strap of her handbag, her knuckles white with tension. His eyes lingered on a single, rebellious strand of dark hair that had fallen from her carefully constructed bun to rest against the nape of her neck. He was cataloging her, learning her, absorbing every detail of her fear and her fragility. A hot flush crept up her neck and into her cheeks. This was all wrong. This was a nightmare of intimacy she hadn't prepared for. The cold, impersonal exchange she had rehearsed in her mind would have been easier to bear. That she could have walled off, treating it like a painful but necessary medical procedure. But this quiet, intense scrutiny was a siege. He wasn't just trying to breach her body, he was trying to map her soul. A traitorous part of her, a part that had felt invisible for so long, felt a flicker of warmth under his focused attention. For 2 years, men had looked past her, through her, seeing only a tired waitress. But this man, this dangerous, powerful man, saw everything. He saw her intelligence, her sorrow, and now he was seeing her desire, the unwanted blush that was betraying her, even as her mind screamed in protest. She felt a dizzying pull towards him, a moth-like attraction to a flame she knew would incinerate her. It was a terrifying feeling, this spark of connection with the man who was paying to own her for the night, a man who represented a world of power and privilege she could only ever borrow for a few sordid hours. She wore a simple silver necklace, a delicate chain with a small teardrop pendant. It was one of the few nice things she had left from her old life, a gift from her father for her 18th birthday. In her nervousness, she had been touching it all night, and the clasp had twisted around to the side, Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "Allow me," he whispered, his voice so close it was almost a thought inside her own head. Before she could react, he stepped behind her. Her entire body went rigid. She was intensely aware of his chest, just inches from her back, of the sheer size of him enveloping her. She stared out the window at the distant, indifferent lights of a bridge, her own reflection, a ghostly image against the glass. She saw his hands come up, his long fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. He didn't fumble. He simply gathered the delicate chain, his knuckles brushing the exquisitely sensitive skin at the nape of her neck. The contrast was electric. The cool, smooth metal of the chain, the unexpected warmth of his skin against hers, the whisper of his breath near her ear. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her. He found the clasp and with a deft movement, straightened the necklace. His task was done, but his hands did not retreat. They lingered. His thumbs rested for a moment at the base of her skull, gently, almost soothingly, stroking the soft skin there. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected intimacy that it shattered the last of her defenses. All the fight, all the fear, all the shame, dissolved into a single, terrifying wave of pure, unadulterated longing. He was seducing her with patience, with intelligence, with a touch that promised not violence, but a deep, possessive understanding. And as he finally let his hands fall, leaving the skin on her neck tingling as if it had been burned, Alara knew she was utterly, hopelessly lost. The silence that followed his touch was a living thing, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Alara stood frozen, her back to him, her skin still singing from the ghost of his fingers. She felt him shift, and she braced herself for the inevitable, for the crude instruction or the rough hand that would finally drag this agonizing prelude to its conclusion. Instead, she heard him move to her side, and when she dared to look, he was simply standing there, his hand extended, palm up. It was not a demand. It was an invitation, a gesture that was somehow more unnerving than any command would have been. It offered her the illusion of choice, a final chance to be a willing participant in her own ruin. Her mind screamed at her to run, to slap that hand away and flee back to her world of peeling paint and honest poverty. But her body, the traitorous vessel that had already betrayed her with a blush and a shiver, seemed to have its own will. Slowly, as if moving through water, she lifted her own trembling hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm, and the connection was sealed. He was no longer just a client, and she was no longer just a service provider. They were two people, bound by a dark and unspoken contract, walking towards an inevitable conclusion. He led her from the living area, down a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were bare, the silence broken only by the soft whisper of their footsteps on the polished stone floor. It felt like a procession, a slow, solemn march towards a sacrifice. She kept her eyes down, studying the intricate patterns in the marble, focusing on anything other than the man whose hand held hers so possessively. The bedroom was an extension of the rest of the penthouse, immense, minimalist, and dominated by a breathtaking view of the city. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, and the lights of Manhattan spread out below them like a king's ransom in jewels. The bed was a vast, low platform, dressed in simple, dark linens, looking less like a place of rest and more like an altar. He didn't lead her to it, not yet. He guided her to the center of the room, turning her gently to face the window. Her own reflection stared back at her, a pale, wide-eyed ghost superimposed over the glittering skyline. It was a cruel juxtaposition, the frightened, insignificant girl, and the vast, powerful city that was about to swallow her whole. She felt his presence behind her, a warm, solid wall at her back. She watched in the reflection as his hands came up to the nape of her neck, his fingers deftly finding the tiny, hidden zipper of her sapphire dress. The sound of the zipper was unnaturally loud in the silent room, a slow, metallic ripping sound that felt like he was peeling away her skin, not just her clothes. The cool night air hit her back, and she shivered as the silk parted. The dress did not fall. He held it in place for a moment, his knuckles brushing against her spine, before letting it glide down her body, pooling at her feet in a whisper of blue fabric. And then she was standing before him, before the city, in nothing but the armor the agency had provided. The lingerie was a confection of black lace and delicate straps, a stark, intricate web against the pale ivory of her skin. It was designed for seduction, a costume for a fantasy, but on her, it felt like a brand marking her as something she was not. It felt obscene, a mockery of the girl who used to sleep in oversized, worn-out t-shirts. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the sight of her own shameful reflection. She waited for a crude remark, a rough touch, the grunt of male approval she had been warned about. But all she heard was a slow, quiet intake of breath behind her. "Exquisite," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. His hands came to rest on her bare shoulders, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't grope or squeeze. He simply held her, his thumbs stroking the delicate bones there, a gesture that was almost comforting. He bent his head, his lips brushing against her hair, just above her ear. "I knew you would be beautiful," he whispered, his breath warm and intoxicating, but not like this. He kissed her shoulder, his lips soft, and then the other, tracing the lace strap of her bra with his tongue, sending a bolt of pure, unadulterated shock through her. This was not the brutish encounter she had steeled herself for. This was a slow, meticulous seduction, and it was terrifyingly effective. He turned her around to face him, his gray eyes searching hers, looking for something she couldn't name. He lifted a hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His gaze dropped, cataloging her with that same intense focus as before. He looked at the gentle swell of her breasts, rising and falling with her ragged breaths, barely constrained by the delicate lace. His eyes followed the narrow line of her waist and the gentle, feminine curve of her hips. He was not just looking at a body, he was admiring a work of art, and his silent, reverent appreciation made her feel more naked than the lack of clothing ever could. He guided her backwards, step by step, until the back of her knees met the edge of the bed. She sank down onto the cool, crisp sheets, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. He knelt before her, and gently, he began to remove her stockings, his fingers rolling the silk down her legs with an agonizing slowness. When he finally came over her on the bed, his body eclipsing the city lights, the last vestiges of her control finally snapped. This was it, the point of no return. A wave of pure, animal panic surged through her. This was a stranger. This was a transaction. This was the ruin of her soul. "Julian," she gasped, her voice a thin, reedy thing. Wait. The word was a feeble protest, a final, desperate plea from the girl she used to be. It was meant to stop him, to push him away, but it came out as a broken whisper, already half surrendered. He paused, his weight resting on his elbows above her, his face just inches from hers. He looked into her eyes, and she saw not anger or impatience, but a flicker of dark, possessive triumph. He had wanted her to fight. He had wanted this last, token resistance, and then he lowered his head and silenced her protest with his lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was deep and consuming, a kiss that tasted of expensive whiskey and absolute control. It was a statement of ownership, and it shattered the last of her resolve. The dam of fear and shame and tightly repressed longing that she had built inside herself for months finally broke, and a tidal wave of sensation washed over her. The protest on her lips died, swallowed by a sound she didn't recognize, a low, guttural moan of pure, unadulterated surrender. The pleasure was so sharp, so sudden and overwhelming, it was almost painful. It was a fire, and she was willingly walking into the heart of it, letting it burn away everything she had been, leaving only the woman he was turning her into. The kiss was a cataclysm, a breaking point from which there was no return. It plunged her into a world of pure, unthinking sensation, a place where the crushing weight of her reality could not follow. Her mind, which had been racing with fear and shame, went blissfully, terrifyingly silent. All that remained was the here and now, the overwhelming presence of him, the tangle of their limbs on the cool, dark sheets, and the city lights outside the window blurring into long, beautiful streaks of color through her half-closed, tear-filled eyes. His hands were not gentle now, but they were not cruel. They were firm, possessive, learning the curves of her body with an assured, demanding touch that left a trail of fire in its wake. He moved with a rhythm that was both primal and controlled, a slow, deep cadence that seemed to resonate with a need buried so deep inside her she never knew it existed. She was lost, adrift on a storm-tossed sea of pleasure so intense it bordered on pain, each wave pulling her further from the shore of who she used to be. Small, broken sounds escaped her throat, sounds she didn't recognize as her own soft gasps and whimpering cries that were swallowed by the vast, silent bedroom. In the throes of that beautiful, terrible chaos, as she felt herself dissolving, coming apart at the seams, his voice cut through the haze. It was low, strained, a command laced with his own fracturing control. "Alara, look at me." The words were an anchor in the storm. It took every ounce of her will to obey, to lift her heavy eyelids and focus on the face above her. She had expected to see the cool, detached master of the universe, the man who had appraised her like an object. But that man was gone. In his place was a stranger, his handsome face taut with a raw, unguarded pleasure, his jaw clenched, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. His gray eyes, usually so calculating and cold, were dark now, almost black, and they burned with a fire that mirrored her own. In that moment, the power dynamic vanished. They were not a billionaire and a girl for hire. They were simply a man and a woman, stripped bare of all pretense, caught in the same vortex of overwhelming sensation. Seeing his own vulnerability was a revelation, a dangerous spark of connection in the heart of a purely physical act. It gave her the permission she didn't know she needed to let go completely. A deep, shuddering groan was torn from his chest, his own control finally breaking, and her name was a ragged sound on his lips. "Alara." And hearing it, hearing the way he said it, as if it were both a prayer and a curse, was her final undoing. She arched against him, a cry of pure, unadulterated release escaping her, her body convulsing in a wave of pleasure so profound it felt like a small death, a final, complete surrender of her body, her will, her very soul. In the quiet aftermath, as their ragged breaths slowly evened and their racing hearts returned to a semblance of normalcy, a strange and deceptive peace settled over her. The storm had passed. He didn't pull away. Instead, he gathered her into his arms, pulling her limp, exhausted body against the warm, solid wall of his chest. His hand, which had been so demanding just moments before, now moved with a surprising tenderness, stroking her damp hair away from her face, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her spine. He didn't speak. There were no words that could fit the vast, silent space between them. Curled against him, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear, A treacherous thought began to form in Alara's mind. Maybe this wasn't just a transaction. Maybe the connection she felt, the raw vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, was real. Wrapped in the darkness and the warmth of his embrace, she allowed herself to believe the lie. She was not a commodity. She was a woman, desired and cherished. The shame receded, replaced by a profound weariness and a fragile, foolish sense of belonging. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first thing she noticed upon waking was the cold. A draft from the vast floor-to-ceiling window chilled her bare skin. The second thing she noticed was the emptiness. The space beside her in the enormous bed was vacant, the sheets cool and undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all. She sat up, clutching the dark linen to her chest, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud of dread. The intimacy of the night had evaporated with the darkness, leaving no trace. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, streamed into the room, stripping the shadows of their mystery and revealing the space for what it was. Not a lover's sanctuary, but a cold, sterile hotel suite of a room, devoid of any personal touch. And then she saw it. On the sleek, black nightstand beside the bed, where his watch and phone had been, sat a single object, a thick, crisp, white business envelope. It had no name on it. It was anonymous, impersonal, clinical. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She didn't need to open it. She knew exactly what it was. It was her payment. Her 30 pieces of silver. The illusion of the night, the fantasy of connection and tenderness she had so desperately clung to, shattered into a million tiny, glittering shards. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. The paper was cool and stiff. Inside, she could feel the thick, unyielding stack of bills. He hadn't even stayed to say goodbye. He hadn't left a note. He had simply left his fee, like one would leave a tip for a waitress after a satisfactory meal. The beautiful, complex, and terrifyingly intimate seduction had been nothing more than a prelude to a simple, crude financial exchange. She had been bought, used, and paid for. The shame came crashing back, a physical, sickening wave that left her breathless. The body that had experienced such transcendent pleasure just hours before now felt alien and soiled. She sat there, alone in the vast, empty bed, clutching the envelope to her chest, the morning sun illuminating her disgrace as the city of New York woke up, indifferent and unaware, far, far below. The taxi ride back from Manhattan to Queens felt like a journey through time, a reverse Cinderella story where the beautiful gown was just a memory and the glass slipper was a thick, white envelope of shame tucked inside her worn handbag. The city transformed around her, the gleaming, optimistic spires of steel and glass giving way to the squat, tired brick buildings of her neighborhood. The sun was brighter here, less filtered by the shadows of skyscrapers, and it felt accusatory, its cheerful morning light exposing the grit and the grime she had tried to escape for one night. The doorman at Julian's building had looked straight through her, his professional indifference, a final, subtle confirmation of her status. She had been an overnight delivery, a package now returned to sender. Her own building had no doorman, only a heavy front door that groaned in protest and the familiar, lingering smell of damp concrete and tenants cooking. Each of the 4 flights of stairs was a penance, the climb leaving her breathless and her legs aching, pulling her further down from the penthouse in the clouds and deeper into the suffocating gravity of her life. She unlocked the door to her apartment and was immediately assaulted by the reality of it. After the vast, silent, and impeccably clean space she had just left, her own small home felt cluttered, loud, and alive, with a misery that was uniquely hers. The rhythmic drip of the kitchen faucet, a sound she usually tuned out, was now a maddening, relentless tick, counting down the seconds of her disgrace. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint, sweet smell of her father's antiseptic soap lingering on a towel she hadn't yet washed. This place, which had once been her only sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and she had brought the scent of the predator back into it with her. She walked on numb legs to the small, wobbly kitchen table that served as her dining room and office. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she pulled the envelope from her bag. It felt heavy, obscene, a foreign object in her humble world. She ripped it open, not with anticipation, but with a dull, morbid curiosity. The money spilled out onto the worn wood of the table. A cascade of crisp, new $100 bills, more cash than she had ever seen in her life. It was a fortune. It was the answer to her prayers. It was enough for the hospital bills, enough to stop the threatening phone calls, enough to give her father a sliver of the comfort he deserved. It was salvation, bought and paid for. But as she stared at the silent, green faces of presidents, she felt no relief, no joy. She only felt a profound, cavernous emptiness. The money was a brand, a physical manifestation of what she had sacrificed, and it radiated a coldness that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. She backed away from the table, from the pile of cash that felt more like an accusation than a solution. Her body ached with a deep, soul-crushing weariness. She needed coffee. She needed to wash the scent of him from her skin. She needed to do something, anything, to feel normal again. Her eyes scanned the small living room, landing on a messy stack of her father's things on a bookshelf, books and old journals he had brought over months ago, in a futile attempt to work from her apartment before he had gotten too sick. On top of the stack was an old business magazine, a relic from his world of ambition and commerce. She had meant to throw it out a dozen times, but hadn't had the heart. And now, it seemed to call to her, her gaze locked onto the cover. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stared back at her from the glossy page. He was leaning forward slightly, an expression of supreme confidence and predatory intelligence on his face. His hair was dark and perfectly cut. His jaw was sharp and resolute, and his eyes were a startling, familiar shade of stormy gray. It was Julian Thorne. A jolt, cold and sharp, went through her. Seeing him here, in the cold light of day, in a context so far removed from the shadowed intimacy of his bedroom, was profoundly disorienting. This was not the quiet, lonely man who had spoken to her of art and loss. This was a public figure, a titan, a shark. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Why did her father have this? Her eyes, as if pulled by a terrible magnetism, drifted from his face to the bold, white headline emblazoned across his chest. The Thorne Doctrine. How billionaire Julian Thorne devoured a rival and redefined the rules of corporate warfare. The word devoured leapt off the page, a word of such calculated violence it made her stomach clench. It was the exact word he had used to describe the painting. The red, a smaller, passionate entity, being consumed and neutralized by the vast, cold emptiness of the blue. A sick, creeping dread began to snake its way up her spine. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she reached out and picked up the magazine. It felt heavy, like a stone tablet engraved with a prophecy. She forced herself to read the subheading, the smaller print beneath the aggressive title. In a move that stunned Wall Street, Thorne Industries completed its hostile takeover of architectural giant Vance Corp, leaving the once proud firm in ruins and cementing Thorne's reputation as the most ruthless player in the game. Vance Corp. The words didn't register at first. They were just letters, familiar but nonsensical in this context. Vance Corp. Her father's company, her family's name, her legacy, her childhood, her entire world before the fall. The magazine slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering to the floor with a soft, dismissive slap. The room began to spin. The air grew thin. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a nightmare, a cruel joke of the universe. But she knew, with a certainty that was as absolute and as devastating as a death sentence, that it was the truth. The man whose bed she had just left, the man whose hands had explored every inch of her body, the man whose whispers of praise were still echoing in her memory, was the architect of her family's destruction. He was the faceless, monstrous entity that had ripped her father's life's work to shreds, the man who had caused his stroke, the man who had plunged them into this pit of debt and despair. The memories of the night replayed in her mind, no longer sensual and intoxicating, but twisted into a grotesque horror film. His questions about her art history degree, his feigned pity about her having to stop her studies, his praise of her beauty, it was all a sick, triumphant game. He knew who she was from the very beginning. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a final, degrading victory lap. He hadn't just ruined her father. He had come to claim the last thing of value her family had left his daughter. The realization hit her not as a thought, but as a physical blow. A strangled animal sound was torn from her throat as she stumbled backward, crashing into the table. The pile of blood money scattered across the floor, littering the space around her feet like confetti at a funeral. And there, in the ruins of her small apartment, surrounded by the price of her own desecration, Elara Vance finally collapsed, her body racked with sobs of a grief so profound it felt like it would unmake her completely. The storm of tears eventually passed, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than the grief itself. Elara lay on the cold floor of her apartment for what felt like hours, the scattered $100 bills a mocking testament to her ruin. The sobs that had racked her body had hollowed her out, carving away the soft, frightened girl and leaving something hard and sharp in her place. A chilling clarity began to settle over her. The shock, the horror, the profound sense of violation, they all began to coalesce, crystallizing into a single, diamond-hard point of rage. It was a cold, quiet fury, a stark contrast to the hot, messy grief of before. It steadied her trembling hands and cleared the fog from her mind. She was no longer a victim to be pitied. She was the daughter of Arthur Vance, and the man who had destroyed her father had just slept in her bed, had paid for the privilege of desecrating his legacy. The thought did not make her want to weep again. It made her want to fight. The money on the floor was not a payment. It was evidence. The intimacy he had feigned was not a seduction. It was an act of war. She rose from the floor with a newfound, almost terrifying resolve. Her movements were no longer sluggish with despair, but precise and deliberate. She walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her swollen face, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. The wide, haunted eyes of a victim stared back, and she narrowed them, forcing them into the cold glare of a predator. He thought he had won. He thought he had taken everything, paid his fee, and closed the account. He was wrong. Tucked inside the cold, white envelope, she found what she was looking for, a sleek black business card from the agency, and on the back, a handwritten number for any necessary correspondence. A private line. His private line. She picked up her phone, her fingers moving with unwavering certainty. She didn't know what she would say, only that the silence was no longer an option. An assistant with a crisp, impersonal voice answered. "Mr. Thorne's office." "I need to speak with him," Elara said. Her own voice was alien to her ears, a low, steady tone devoid of any inflection or emotion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne is in meetings all day. May I ask who is calling?" "My name is Elara. Tell him it's about last night. Tell him I know who he island." The words were a threat, a promise, and she knew he would understand. There was a pause on the other end, the smooth facade of the assistant cracking for just a moment. She was put on hold. The soulless corporate music, a stark contrast to the violent symphony in her chest. A minute later, the assistant's voice returned, noticeably different, laced with a new, cautious respect. "Mr. Thorne can see you at his office in 1 hour." The journey to his corporate headquarters was the antithesis of her trip to his penthouse. She did not wear a borrowed silk dress. She put on her own clothes, a pair of simple dark jeans, a plain white blouse, and the worn but clean jacket she wore to her waitressing job. This was her uniform, her identity, not a costume he had paid for. As the taxi cut through the heart of the financial district, she looked at the towering buildings, not with awe or intimidation, but with a cold, strategic eye. These were the weapons of his world, the monuments to the kind of power that had crushed her father. Thorne Tower was the largest of them all, a blade of black glass and steel that sliced into the sky, so tall it seemed to challenge the sun itself. The lobby was designed to diminish any who entered it. The ceilings were impossibly high, the floors a vast expanse of polished black marble that reflected a distorted, lesser version of yourself. The air was chilled and still, carrying the faint, sterile scent of money and ambition. Men and women in expensive suits moved with a silent, hurried purpose, their faces impassive masks. It was a temple built to the god of commerce, and Julian Thorne was its high priest. She walked to the massive, monolithic reception desk, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The receptionist, a woman with unnervingly perfect hair and a practiced, empty smile, looked down at her. "Can I help you?" I have an appointment with Mr. Thorne. My name is Alara Vance. She added her last name deliberately, a stone cast into the placid waters of his corporate empire. The receptionist's smile faltered. She typed something into her computer, and her eyebrows shot up for a fraction of a second before her professional mask snapped back into place. Of course, Miss Vance. Please, take the private elevator on your right, the top floor. The elevator ascended in absolute silence, a smooth, swift climb to the summit of power. This time, she wasn't a nervous girl ascending to a stranger's bedroom. She was an executioner, rising to meet a condemned man, even if he didn't know it yet. The doors opened directly into a reception area that was even more austere than the lobby, and beyond a set of imposing double doors was his office. It was a conqueror's throne room. 2 walls were pure glass, offering a 180-degree panorama of the city he dominated. His desk was an enormous slab of black granite, empty save for a sleek laptop and a single, ominous-looking financial terminal. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking down on his kingdom just as he had in the penthouse. "You wanted to see me," he said, without turning around. His voice was calm, controlled, betraying nothing. Alara walked forward, her shoes making no sound on the thick, dark carpet. She didn't stop until she reached the granite desk, a vast, empty continent between them. She reached into her bag, her hand closing not around the envelope of money, but around the magazine. She slapped it down on the cold, hard surface. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent office. He turned then, slowly, his face an unreadable mask of cool neutrality. His gray eyes held hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something not surprise, but a dark, knowing curiosity. He had been expecting this. He had been waiting for it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, did not tremble. It was low, clear, and venomous. "Vance Corp," she said, the name of her father, of her family, a 2-word indictment. She pushed the magazine towards him. "You devoured it. That was the word you used, wasn't it?" A smaller, passionate entity, consumed by the vast, cold emptiness of the blue. She threw his own artistic analysis back in his face, the words now tasting like poison in her mouth. "Was this part of the takeover, Julian? The final acquisition? Did you get a thrill out of it? Finding the daughter of the man you destroyed and buying her for the night? Was her price listed as a business expense?" The questions poured out of her, each one a dagger aimed at his cold, impassive heart. She refused to cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would stand here in the heart of his empire and force him to look at the human wreckage he had left in his wake. Her accusation hung in the air, thick and toxic, and he just watched her, his expression unchanging, his silence more damning than any confession. He let her words hang in the vast, silent office, letting the echoes of her rage fade until only a tense, humming silence remained. He did not flinch, he did not look away, he did not show a single flicker of guilt or surprise. He simply stood there, absorbing her fury as if it were nothing more than a mild passing storm. The complete absence of a reaction was more unnerving than any denial would have been. When the silence had stretched to a breaking point, he finally moved. He walked with a calm, unhurried gait from the window to his enormous granite desk, the physical barrier between them now a throne he was reclaiming. He sat down in his large leather chair, the picture of untouchable corporate power, and steepled his long fingers, his cool gray eyes never leaving hers. "Vance Corp," he said, his voice as calm and measured as if they were discussing the weather. "It was an inefficient company, poorly managed and sentimental. Your father was an artist, not a warrior. In the world I inhabit, sentiment is a liability. Its collapse was not a tragedy, Alara. It was an inevitability." His words were like stones, each one a cold, hard blow. He spoke of her father's life's work with the detached analysis of a coroner examining a corpse. There was no malice in his voice, but there was no sympathy either, only the brutal, unapologetic logic of a predator. "You think I destroyed him?" he continued, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of amusement in his tone. "I simply introduced a superior business model. He couldn't compete. The market did the rest. It was nothing personal. It was just business." "Business?" she repeated, her voice a low, trembling whisper of disbelief. "You call what you did to my family Business? He had a stroke, you monster. He is a shell of the man he once was, because of you. An unfortunate but statistically predictable outcome of extreme professional stress, Julian replied, his clinical detachment making her blood run cold. He leaned forward slightly, the mask of indifference shifting into something sharper, more focused. But you are mistaken about one thing. Last night was not business. And it was certainly not a coincidence. Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. A new, more terrifying dread began to dawn. What do you mean? She asked, though a part of her already knew, and was screaming at her not to ask, not to hear the answer. I knew who you were, the moment your file appeared on my screen, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that was a horrifying echo of the night before. The Elysian Circle is very thorough. They provide detailed backgrounds on all their candidates. Your education at Columbia, your father's name, the recent bankruptcy of his company, it was all there. I chose you, Alara. Specifically, the floor seemed to drop away beneath her. This was a new level of cruelty, a calculated, psychopathic sadism she couldn't begin to comprehend. The last, fragile hope that this had been a random, tragic twist of fate was utterly annihilated. This had been a performance, a hunt. Why? The word was a choked, broken sound. Why would you do that? Julian rose from his chair and began to walk slowly around the desk, circling her like a shark. Because my acquisition of Vance Corp felt incomplete, he explained, his voice thoughtful, as if discussing a minor flaw in a masterpiece he had acquired. I owned the buildings, the assets, the intellectual property, but a company's true legacy isn't in its balance sheets, it's in its bloodline. I saw a picture of your father in a financial paper after the collapse. He was standing outside his old office, looking defeated. And you were beside him, your arm in his, looking at him with a fierce, protective loyalty. I acquired his company, but he still had you. He stopped in front of her, his proximity suffocating. I became intrigued, obsessed even, with the one thing I couldn't purchase. The daughter of my vanquished rival. Your father's greatest creation was never a building, Alara. It was you. And I am a collector of rare and beautiful things. Revulsion, pure and undiluted, rose in her throat. She was a trophy, a final spoil of war. The thought was so grotesque it made her physically sick. She took a step back, her rage returning, hot and clean. You are insane, she hissed. You are a monster. I am a pragmatist, he corrected her calmly. He gestured to the magazine on his desk, then to the city beyond the glass walls. And I am the only solution to your problems. He began to list them, his voice ticking off each point with the precision of an accountant. The debt from the bankruptcy, which I believe is in the 7 figures, the mortgage on your family home, which is months from foreclosure, and your father's medical care. The clinic he is in is adequate, but it is not the best. With his condition, the right treatment could make a significant difference. The kind of treatment that costs a fortune. He let the weight of her reality settle upon her, a crushing, inescapable burden, and then he made his offer. I am prepared to solve all of it, he said, his voice deceptively gentle. I will assume every dollar of your family's debt. I will pay off your mortgage. I will have your father transferred to the finest neurological facility in the country, with the best doctors money can buy. I will give you back the life you lost. Alara stared at him, her mind reeling. It was a lifeline, a miracle, an escape from an impossible situation, but she knew there was a price. In return for what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled then, a cold, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. You, he said simply, you will belong to me. This will no longer be a transaction for a single night. It will be an arrangement. You will leave that pathetic apartment and your dead-end job. You will live in the penthouse. You will be at my disposal for conversation, for travel, for my bed, whenever I require it. You will be my exclusive companion. He was offering her a gilded cage, a prison of luxury and dependence. He was offering to save her family by enslaving her. It was a devil's bargain, laid out on a granite desk on the top floor of the world. Your pride, Alara, he said softly, seeing the war in her eyes, or your father's future. It's a simple choice, when you think about it. He walked back behind his desk, his confidence absolute. He knew he had her trapped. "Go home," he said, his voice a soft, final command. "Look at the eviction notices. Look at your father's medical chart, and when you have made the only logical decision, you will call me." He didn't need to say anything more. The offer, the ultimatum, hung in the air between them, a glittering, poisonous promise. And as Alara turned and walked out of that conqueror's office, she felt not like she was leaving a negotiation, but like a pawn being moved into its final, inescapable position on a board she had never even agreed to play on. The days that followed his offer were a special kind of hell, a purgatory of impossible choices. Alara walked through her life like a ghost, her body performing the familiar rituals of work and family visits, while her mind was trapped in that cold glass office, endlessly replaying his words. His offer wasn't a lifeline, it was a carefully forged chain, and every aspect of her reality seemed to be conspiring to help him lock it around her neck. An eviction notice, taped cruelly to her apartment door, appeared in stark black and white, its legal jargon, a formal declaration of her failure. At the cafe, her boss cut her hours, citing budget constraints, and the meager contents of her tip jar felt like a joke. The final, decisive blow came during a visit to her father. A new doctor, a kind but pragmatic woman, sat her down and spoke of an experimental treatment, a new therapy that showed incredible promise for stroke victims like her father. It was a glimmer of real, tangible hope, a chance for him to reclaim a piece of the life he had lost. And then came the price, a number so astronomical it might as well have been the distance to the moon. In that sterile, hopeful hospital corridor, the last of Alara's pride crumbled to dust. Julian Thorne had been right. He was a monster, but he was a monster who held the only key to her father's salvation. That night, she sat in the dark of her apartment, the silence, a canvas for her warring thoughts. To accept his offer was to surrender, to become his property, his final living trophy. The thought filled her with a nauseating self-loathing. But to refuse was to sentence her father to a lesser life, to watch him fade away in a second-rate clinic while she clung to a pride that would keep no one warm, pay no one's bills. It was then that a new thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, took root in the barren soil of her despair. What if this wasn't a surrender? What if it was an infiltration? A Trojan horse? She would take his money, she would live in his penthouse, she would let him believe he had won. But she would not be a passive victim, she would be a poison, an enemy within his walls. She would learn his weaknesses, she would study his empty soul, and she would find a way to make him pay for what he had done, not just with his money, but with something he truly valued, if such a thing even existed. This rationalization, this desperate reframing of submission as strategy, was the only thing that allowed her to breathe again. It was a lie, she told herself, but it was a necessary one. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, she picked up the phone. When he answered, his voice was as calm and confident as she knew it would be. "I accept your terms," she said, her voice a flat, cold instrument of commerce. "A car will be there in an hour," he replied, and hung up. Her return to the penthouse was a grim, silent affair. She carried a single, battered suitcase containing the few remnants of her former life. Julian was waiting for her, standing by the window as always, the master surveying his domain. There were no pleasantries, no feigned seduction. The air was thick with the tension of their new, unholy contract. "Welcome home," he said, the words an assertion of his ownership. Alara dropped her suitcase, the sound a dull thud on the polished floor. "This is not my home," she said, her voice low and tight with a loathing she didn't try to hide. "This is the first payment on a debt you owe my family." He turned to face her, a slow, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Is that what this is? A payment?" he murmured, walking towards her. "Then let me collect." The spark was lit. It was not a spark of seduction, but of pure, unadulterated conflict. When he reached for her, she didn't pull away. She met him head-on, her hands coming up to shove uselessly against the hard wall of his chest. Their second encounter was not a seduction, it was a storm. It was a brutal, desperate clash of wills, a physical manifestation of the hatred, grief, and twisted, undeniable desire that now bound them together. He pushed her back against the wall, his mouth crashing down on hers in a kiss that was not meant to entice, but to conquer. It was a kiss of possession, of anger, of a dark, ravenous hunger. But this time, she was not the frightened, pliant girl from before. She fought back. She kissed him back with a fury that matched his own, her teeth grazing his lip, the coppery taste of blood, a shocking, thrilling jolt to her senses. This was not about pleasure. This was about power, about inflicting as much as was inflicted upon her. He ripped the simple blouse from her body, the sound of tearing fabric, a savage sound in the silent apartment. His hands were rough, leaving marks, branding her as his property. But her hands were just as desperate, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his back, seeking to leave her own scars, to prove that she was not just a passive object in his possession. They fell onto the vast bed, a tangle of limbs and fury. It was a desperate, chaotic battle. Every touch was a collision, every kiss an attack. The careful, worshipful exploration of their first night was replaced by a raw, honest violence. He was a force of nature, seeking to overwhelm and dominate her, to erase the defiant woman who had confronted him in his office and leave only the pliant body he had bought. And she met his force with a desperate, self-destructive fury of her own. "You owe me this, Thorn," she gasped out against his shoulder, the words a raw, guttural cry from the depths of her soul. She was no longer just submitting. She was taking, claiming her pound of flesh, her voice a confusing, desperate mix of a sob and a snarl. Her cries filled the room, a chaotic symphony of pain, and a pleasure so intense, it felt like anguish. It was the sound of her own breaking, the sound of her grief and rage being burned away in a crucible of toxic passion. He drove into her with a final shuddering groan, and in that moment of violent release, as her own body convulsed in a shattering, involuntary climax, the lines between victor and vanquished, between hatred and desire, were irrevocably and terrifyingly blurred. As the storm subsided, they lay apart on the battlefield of the bed, not touching, their breaths coming in ragged, exhausted gasps. The harsh light from the window illuminated the wreckage of their encounter. Dark, blooming bruises were already beginning to form on her pale skin, the distinct shape of his fingers on her hips, on her arms. A deep, angry scratch, drawn by her own hand, ran across his shoulder blade. They were the scars of their first battle, the physical proof of the brutal contract they had just sealed in the flesh. The deal was done, her family was safe, and Alara, lying in her enemy's bed, marked by his possession, knew that she was now, and perhaps forever, utterly and completely trapped. The checks and balances of her new life were swift and absolute. Within a week, Alara received a series of sterile official emails. The first was a confirmation from the bank. All outstanding debts associated with the Vance family name had been cleared. The second was a notification from a prestigious neurological institute confirming the transfer and admission of Mr. Arthur Vance into their long-term care program. It was everything he had promised. It was the victory she had sold her soul for. She sat on a ridiculously expensive white leather sofa, staring at the phone in her hand, and felt absolutely nothing. There was no relief, no joy, no sense of accomplishment. The news didn't feel like a weight being lifted. It felt like the final, resounding clang of a cage door swinging shut. She hadn't saved her family. Julian Thorne had bought them, just as he had bought her. She was now just another one of his assets, her family's well-being, the collateral that ensured her compliance. Her days settled into a strange and suffocating routine. The penthouse, once an intimidating symbol of power, became her entire world. It was a beautiful, silent prison, filled with art she couldn't enjoy and luxuries she didn't want. A housekeeper, a quiet, older woman who never met her eye, came and went like a phantom, preparing meals Alara rarely had the appetite to eat, and tidying a space that was never messy. Julian had a wardrobe of designer clothes delivered for her, fabrics and styles chosen by some anonymous stylist, erasing the last vestiges of her own identity. He gave her a credit card with no limit, a pointless gesture as she had nowhere to go and no one to see. She was an object on display, the most prized piece in his collection, and he kept her polished, pristine, and utterly isolated. Her plan, her desperate, naive fantasy of being a Trojan horse, of seeking revenge from the inside, felt like a child's foolish dream in the harsh light of her new reality. How could she unravel a man who owned the very air she breathed? Their nights were the only thing that broke the monotony. They were a volatile cycle of conflict and combustion. There was no tenderness, no echo of the careful seduction of their first encounter. There was only a tense, simmering silence that would inevitably be shattered by a sharp word, a perceived slight, a cruel, cutting remark from one of them. These arguments were the kindling, and the fire that followed in the bedroom was the only language they seemed to share. Their passion was a brutal, desperate thing, a place where their hatred and their undeniable toxic attraction could coexist. It was a release, a temporary annihilation of the complexities that lay between them, a place where they could be honest in their mutual destruction. They were two broken, angry people, and this violent communion was the only way they knew how to feel anything other than pain. But in the quiet hours, in the moments between the storms, Alara began to see something else. She began to watch him. She would see him late at night, long after he thought she was asleep, sitting in the dark living room, his face illuminated only by the cold, blue glow of a laptop screen. The mask of the ruthless conqueror would be gone, and in its place was a profound, almost unbearable weariness. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that never fully unclenched. She saw him standing by the window for hours, not in a posture of triumph, but staring down at the city with an expression of such complete and utter loneliness that it made her ache in a way she didn't understand. She realized he had no friends, only employees, allies, and enemies. His life was a series of transactions, of acquisitions and defenses. His magnificent penthouse was not a home, it was a fortress, and he was its solitary prisoner, just as trapped by his wealth and power as she was by her lack of it. One night she woke up from a nightmare, a tangled, terrifying vision of her father calling her name from a place she couldn't reach. A sob escaped her lips before she could stifle it. A moment later, a light switched on, and Julian was there, standing in the doorway of her room. He had insisted they sleep in separate bedrooms, another one of his rules of control, a way to delineate their arrangement. She expected him to be annoyed, to tell her to be quiet. Instead, he walked over to her bed and sat on the edge, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a silent, powerful presence. Then, with a hesitation she had never seen in him before, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was just there, a solid, warm anchor in the terrifying darkness of her mind. They sat like that for a long time, in a silence that was not hostile or tense, but strangely peaceful. In that moment, he was not Julian Thorne, the monster who had ruined her. He was just a man, sitting in the dark with a frightened woman, offering a strange and unexpected comfort. This was the beginning of her unraveling. Her hatred for him was a clear, sharp, defining thing. It was the bedrock of her new identity. But these other feelings, they were a confusing, insidious fog, a flicker of pity for his loneliness, a grudging respect for the discipline that drove him, and a deep, shameful physical dependency, a craving for the violent release of their nights that she was horrified to acknowledge. The clean lines of their dynamic captor and captive, victor and vanquished began to blur into a messy, incomprehensible tangle. What was this thing between them? It wasn't love, not the kind she had read about or dreamed of. That was a gentle, nurturing thing. This was a jagged, destructive force, a bond forged in ruin and sealed in conflict. Was it simply revenge, her body betraying her mind's mission, or was this something else entirely? Perhaps, for two people as broken as they were, this was the only kind of connection possible. Not a home built in the light, but a shared cage in the dark. Two prisoners clinging to each other for warmth, each finding a strange, bitter comfort in the familiar scars of the other. As she lay in her bed long after he had returned to his own, the warmth of his hand still tingling on hers, Alara felt the last of her certainty slipping away, leaving her adrift in a terrifying, ambiguous sea. The night air was cool and thin, a stark contrast to the heated, complicated silence of the penthouse behind her. Alara stood on the balcony, her hands gripping the cold steel railing, and looked down at the city. It was a clear night, and New York was a breathtaking tapestry of light and shadow, a living, breathing entity, that was utterly indifferent to the small human dramas playing out within it. She had just finished a call with her father's new doctor. The news was good, better than she had dared to hope. The experimental treatments were working. His speech was improving, his cognitive function returning. For the first time in a long time, the doctor had used the word recovery. This was it. This was the victory. The tangible, undeniable proof that her sacrifice had been worth it. Her family was safe. Her father had a future. She had won. But as she stood there, suspended between the glittering city and the dark, silent sky, she felt a profound, soul-deep emptiness. There was no triumph, no relief, only the hollow ache of the cost. She had saved her family by caging herself, trading her freedom for their security. The city below, with its millions of anonymous, ordinary lives, seemed like a paradise she could see but never touch. Down there, people fell in love, argued over bills, chased their dreams, failed, and tried again. They were free. She was an object, a beautiful, well-maintained fixture in a billionaire's private collection. She had everything she could possibly need, and nothing that she truly wanted. The life she had saved for her father was one she could no longer be a part of, not really. She was a visitor from another world, the gilded, lonely world of Julian Thorne. She turned away from the breathtaking, heartbreaking view and looked back through the floor to ceiling glass doors into the bedroom. The room was dark, save for a single, low-wattage lamp that cast long, soft shadows. In the center of the vast bed, she could see his form, a dark shape under the expensive linens. He was asleep. From this distance, he was just a man. The ruthless titan of industry, the cold, calculating monster who had orchestrated her family's ruin, the possessive, passionate captor who marked her skin with his ownership, all of those men were gone, vanished into the vulnerability of sleep. The lines of tension were erased from his face. The mask of cold control had fallen away. In the quiet stillness of the night, he looked unguarded, almost peaceful, and profoundly alone. A wave of conflicting emotions so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. The hatred was still there, a cold, hard ember in her gut that would never be fully extinguished. He was the man who had broken her father and bought his daughter. That was a truth that could never be undone. But tangled up with the hate was a web of other, more complicated things. There was a dark, physical dependency, a shameful craving for the violent intimacy that was their only form of communication. There was a flicker of pity for the lonely man who had built a fortress of wealth so high he had imprisoned himself within it. And beneath it all, there was something else, something she dared not name, a terrifying, toxic attachment that felt horrifically like belonging. Who was this man, this stranger, who knew the sound of her cries in the dark, the man whose quiet presence could soothe her nightmares? And who was she, the woman who stood watching him sleep, her hand hovering in the air, caught between the urge to smooth the hair from his forehead and the desire to press a pillow over his face? She had walked into this arrangement with a child's fantasy of revenge, believing she could be a poison in his veins. But she hadn't accounted for the nature of poison. It doesn't just harm the host, it corrupts the vessel that carries it. She hadn't changed him, not really, but he had irrevocably changed her. The clear, sharp lines of right and wrong, of love and hate, of victim and victor, had all dissolved into a gray, ambiguous fog. She pushed the glass door open and stepped back into the silent, air-conditioned chill of the room. She walked quietly to the side of the bed and stood over him, a ghost in her own life. The deal was fulfilled. She could, in theory, leave. She could walk out the door and attempt to piece together a life in the city below. But she knew she wouldn't. The cage had become familiar. The silence had become a language. Her captor had become her only companion. There was no victory here. He hadn't won. She hadn't won. They were just two damaged souls, trapped in the luxurious wreckage he had created, bound together by a shared history of destruction. So the question remained, whispering in the dark, a final, haunting thought for a story with no end. Did she save her family only to become the final, most prized jewel in the collection of the man who had everything? Or was her presence here something more? A crack in his armor, a ghost in his perfect, sterile machine, the one unpredictable variable that could force a monster to feel? And in doing so, was she becoming his ultimate undoing, or simply the architect of her own?